In this lesson, we'll talk about a second type of geometry that we can use in Maya, and these are called NURBS. So that's NURBS, N-U-R-B-S. It stands for Non-Uniform Rational B-Spline. Really, the gist of NURBS is that you've got a very smooth surface that's calculated here in Maya. Now, the NURBS object consists of patches that are just four-sided sheets of geometry, you can think of them as. Okay, so you can see we have a plane here. Any of the shapes that we create are going to be some sort of configuration of this four-sided plane. Okay, and so one of the directions on the plane is going to be the U direction, and the other direction is going to be the V direction. So you hear about the UV coordinates. That's kind of what we're talking about here as far as the measurements on this or the location on this patch. Okay, so for instance, if we have a NURBS cylinder like this, you can see it's basically just a NURBS rectangle, and it's been folded in on itself. So if you think of this as one of these edges, just think of it as being taking a piece of paper and kind of wrapping it into a tube. Okay, so it's still got that same configuration. As far as this sphere goes, just think of this cylinder, and add a little bit of resolution here, and then you squeeze the tops and the bottom, so it's still that made out of that sort of patch type of a shape, but it's in the shape of now a sphere. You can kind of see the seam there. So you can kind of think of it as a cylinder with the top squeezed in. Okay, same thing for this torus. We can think of it as a cylinder that is bent in a circle so that this cap meets this cap on the end. So you can see here, we actually have a seam on this side, and then we also have a seam where that's rotated around and connected it. So you can kind of visualize that. All right, so just keep that in mind that the NURBS shapes that you create are going to be some sort of configurations. They can be more complex, but they're going to be made up of these patches. Now let's take a look at the different components of a NURBS object. So we're going to have components like we did with the polygon objects, but these components are going to be slightly different. So we'll access them the same way. If we select our NURBS object, we can either go to component mode, hit F8 on our keyboard, or we can right-click to choose the types of components that we'd like to select. We have control vertex. Okay, so this is going to be like the points on our polygon surface, but one of the big things you'll notice right off is that these points aren't sitting on top of the surface. So what's happening is we've got these points in 3D space, and then we're calculating a smooth surface underneath these points. So where these points are, it's using those to calculate this smooth surface that we're able to actually see. So if we were to go ahead and select those points, we can move them, but you can see they don't have a direct correlation. You can see as I move out, sort of stretches further away from that. Okay, so they sort of have some influence over the shape of the object. They're not directly on top of the object. Now we also have these lines here, and so you might think that those are very similar to edges, and they're actually lying on the surface. These are called isoparms, and we can access those by going to isoparm, and we can select those. Okay, now we can't really move those at all, so if I try to move those, I can't move them. They're just lying on that surface. I can add new isoparms if I want to, so I can click and drag one. You can see it's like a dotted yellow line here, and we go to the surfaces menu set, and then we can go to edit NURBS, and if we insert an isoparm, you can see we can now insert an isoparm there. Okay, but we can't directly manipulate or move or transform an isoparm. Okay, it's for kind of our method of adding resolution and detail on our NURBS surface here. The third type is going to be a hull, H-U-L-L. And so if we go to a hull selection, you can see it makes this sort of pink cage around here. And these are basically methods of selecting different configurations of our CVs or our control vertices. So if I click on this hull, you can see it selects that entire top row of CVs. I can now move those around. Okay. If I get out of that and go back to a CV selection, it's the same as if I'd select all of those CVs. Okay. We can also select in the other direction, and it will select all of those as well. Okay, so we can manipulate CVs or control vertices. We can manipulate the hulls. We can't manipulate the isoparms apart from adding new isoparms, getting rid of them. So just keep that in mind. It's a little bit different in that respect. Okay. So when we're building with NURBS geometry, there's going to be a little bit more involved. Polygons are probably a little bit more basic as far as the building tools that we can use. We can start to pull out geometry, extrude pieces, and so forth. It's going to be a little bit harder to go ahead and change the flow of the geometry with these. We're going to have to use multiple pieces to create complex shapes that are seamlessly sort of stitched together rather than making them out of one continuous shape. And so we're able to get very smooth shapes. You can see with our cylinder, if I go over into the inputs, I've got a sections number of 8. And you can see, even at 8, it's very, very smooth. If we had a polygon cylinder with a resolution of 8, it would be very faceted because we'd have a straight line from this point to this point. But you can see we actually have a nice smooth curvature all the way around. So it's not the same as working with polygons. We've got a nice smooth surface here. Okay, so this will enable us, NURBS will enable us to get smooth surfaces. We won't be able to get hard edges as cleanly, or beveled edges. It'll take a little bit more to get those. You can get them, but again, you're going to be working with multiple pieces if you're going to get something that is more a more complex object. Okay, it's also a little bit more difficult to add detail in specific areas than it is with a polygon. Okay, now one of the big things that you're going to be working with when you're working with NURBS are curves. Curves are going to be a big part of creating NURBS objects. Okay, and we can create NURBS primitives just like we did with the polygons. We can go to create NURBS primitives, and you can see the primitives here, and that works the same way with the NURBS primitives interactive creation as well. Okay, but curves are going to play a big role in working with NURBS, so we want to make sure to talk about those. And they have components as well. So if I click on this curve, I can just move it around. This is not something that gets rendered. It's something that we use for construction purposes to build the geometry that gets rendered. So think of these as sort of like edges floating in space. Okay. Now I can click on this, and if I right click, I can go to a control vertex, which just like a NURBS surface, it's sitting off of the surface. And so it's actually using these points to calculate this smooth curve in between. Okay. I can select those CVs and move them around in 3D space. And you can see the curve changes. Okay. So what we can do is draw out curves, and those can be drawn with the CV curve tool. Okay. We can also, there's also EP curve, Bezier curve, pencil curve, which we can talk about later. But the main idea is that the curves are going to be a building block of the NURBS surfaces that we create. So for instance, we could take this curve, we could duplicate it, Control D will duplicate. We can move it over. Now we have two identical curves. And if we select both of these together, and we go to Surfaces and Loft, for instance, we can actually create geometry between two curves. Okay, it doesn't have to be two curves. It could be 3 or 4 curves. Okay, it doesn't matter. And so now we have the geometry that we can actually see, and we've built that using curves. Okay, that's a loft. Now, one of the things that we want to talk about when we're talking about NURBS curves and NURBS surfaces is the parameterization. So if we go ahead and hit Control A to bring up our attribute editor, you can see that in our NURBS curve history on that curve, it has 6 spans. So it's giving us the number of spans that it has along the curve. Okay, and you can see that here, and it's 3-degree curve, which is the smooth curve that we see. All right. If we want to rebuild this and add a different number of spans, we can go to Edit Curves. Let's get rid of our loft here. Okay, so it's got 6 spans, so we can go to Rebuild Curves, and we won't get into this too much. Let's just leave this at uniform and change the number of spans to, let's say, 12. Okay, leave that on 3 or cubic. We'll rebuild this, and now it has 12 spans. So we've kept the basic curvature, but we've added more points in there. Okay, and there are methods for rebuilding to clean up your geometry, but won't really talk about that at this point. Okay, but we can add and remove the points by rebuilding our curve. And we can do the same thing with our NURBS geometry. Okay, this curve only has 12 spans because it only goes in one direction. When we're talking about a NURBS surface, we're talking about U and V. So it can have a different number of spans in the U and in the V. So if we were to take this sphere, instead of rebuilding a curve, we would go to Edit NURBS, Rebuild Surface. Okay, we set that to uniform, and now instead of one spot where we can put in a number, we can go ahead and change both of those spots. Okay, and we can have a different degree in the U and the V. We rebuild that, and now it's 12 by 12. Okay, so we can change the resolution of NURBS surfaces or NURBS curves by rebuilding them. All right, really quickly, just let you take a look at the CV curve tool. We go to create CV curve tool, and we just click to draw out these points, and you can see how the points aren't on the surface. I hit enter to complete that. Go to CV, and then we can move those around. That's how we can get curves into our scene, and then we can start to use those to construct different objects. And we'll actually use this technique a lot when we're building our bike project. As we go through that process, we'll actually use NURBS curves quite a bit, as well as some of the tools like lofting that we just looked at under surface. And all of these can be found in the surfaces menu set, edit curves, surfaces, edit NURBS as well. All right, so that's the second type of geometry that we can work with. Again, it's good for smooth shapes. Sometimes it's good for kind of mechanical shapes. Just keep in mind that it's going to be made of these patches, and so you're going to have to combine many different objects if you're making something that is a little bit more complex. It's going to actually be made of multiple pieces rather than just one single polygon object that you can extrude out. On the other hand, you get something very smooth. Even if you have a low resolution, it's still going to look smooth. It's not going to be faceted. So there are advantages to both polygons and NURBS. In the next lesson, we'll actually look at something that is sort of a combination of a NURBS and polygon workflow. It kind of gives you the best of both worlds, and it's something that's very common in modeling today. And so we'll go ahead and take a look at subdivision surfaces as well as smoothing workflows in the next lesson.